Today I will explore the problem of evil and all the ways I think it goes wrong. First of all, let's quickly define the two main categories of the argument against God from evil. The first being the logical problem of evil. This argument states that any evil whatsoever logically contradicts a God. The second are evidential arguments against God from evil. These don't say that evil makes God impossible, just incredibly unlikely. That the sheer quantity and horrific nature of evil in the world makes God highly improbable. And while both these arguments have challenged even the most formidable religious apologists, it is my view that they fall far short of disproving God. In fact, I think the problem of evil is less effective than people will often realise. To be clear, I'm not saying the argument is useless, but just far from the knockout punch some people may have you believe. In this video, I'll challenge the four main forms of this argument, starting with the one I find the easiest to refute, and ending with the one I think is the most challenging for a theist to defend against. First of all, we have the logical problem of evil. As I mentioned earlier, this is the argument that any evil at all is logically incompatible with God. To put it plainly, there is evil, God wouldn't allow evil, therefore there is no God. For example, someone might say, given that God is infinitely powerful and infinitely good, he could easily stop terrible things like murder. There are many issues with this argument, but I think the easiest way to respond to it would be the free will defense. This states that God has granted us free will, because otherwise any acts of goodness, love, or joy would be meaningless because we wouldn't have chosen to do them in the first place. But on the flip side, this free will necessarily means we also have the freedom to commit evil acts. If God were to eliminate all evil, it would get rid of our freedom to commit, either knowingly or unknowingly, evil acts. This would probably render us closer to highly restricted slaves than truly free moral agents. But this may leave you wondering, what about all the examples of evil that aren't a byproduct of free will, like disease or getting caught in a flash flood? This question brings us onto the second argument, the problem of natural evils. This is a form of the evidential argument against God from evil, and it essentially says, yeah, okay, human evils are a byproduct of human free will, but what about all the other forms of evils that aren't, like tsunamis or hurricanes? Surely a good God would just prevent things like this from happening. My primary response to this would be the natural law defense. This states that in order for us to be truly free moral agents, we have to exist in a system governed by innate natural laws, such as all the strict laws of physics that exist. But why would God need to do this for us to be free moral agents? One reason is that without this stable natural order, things would behave unpredictably. We wouldn't be able to predict outcomes, as they would never follow set natural laws. This would likely prevent us from having rational agency, as we wouldn't be able to make decisions based on expectations or make plans. This is to say, it's highly plausible that without these rigid natural laws, we couldn't be free. Okay, now you may ask, couldn't God just create a natural system without evils? And I think the reality is, it's highly likely that a natural system necessarily must have evils within it. Take, for example, gravity. It allows for stable orbits, ground to walk on, rain to fall, rivers to flow, but it can also create great dangers, like a tree branch falling on top of you, or you could fall to your demise. If gravity just switched off whenever harm was imminent, it wouldn't be a natural law, it would be a miracle, and we'd know it. In this situation, it seems God's existence would be overwhelmingly obvious to us, and this would further prevent us from having free moral agency. What I mean by this is, if God's interventions were empirically undeniable, our morality wouldn't be genuine, it would be coerced. Imagine there was a live stream of your life following you around 24/7, whether you were at work or in the shower, and the police, your parents, and your extended family were watching it at all times. Aside from the fact that this would make your family reunion a bit awkward to say the least, it's clear in this scenario that you'd be forced to act in a certain way, and you certainly wouldn't be free to act as you would normally on your own volition. This is similar to the situation we would find ourselves in if God's existence was undeniable. We wouldn't be free moral agents. In conclusion, it seems that in order for us to have truly free will and moral agency, we would have to exist in a natural system with rigid, innate natural laws. And in a system such as this, natural evils are inevitable. The third form of the problem of evil I'll be looking at is called the problem of gratuitous evil. Gratuitous evil being evils that are unnecessary or serve no purpose. This argument states that while some evils may be necessary to allow for personal development or greater goods, what about all the meaningless evils? What about children with cancer or freak accidents? And I think it's evils like these that understandably make people doubtful of a god. And firstly, it's my view that the free will and natural law defenses actually still work against the problem of gratuitous evils. In other words, it seems that many, if not all, unnecessary evils are a byproduct of free will and natural laws. However, this might just not do it for some people, especially given the emotional reality of such pointless suffering. Luckily, there are other defenses of gratuitous evils, one being the skeptical theism defense. This is the defense that just because we can't see a justification to an evil, that doesn't mean there isn't one. This is because, as humans, we're limited by time and space, and we're also just cognitively limited compared to an omniscient God. And therefore, just because we can't see a purpose behind something doesn't mean there isn't one. Additionally, it's important to remember that within this religious framework, there is an afterlife. This is to say that undue suffering is compensated for in the afterlife, and that temporary earthly suffering would just be a small part in a larger, perfected future. And finally, the single argument from evil I think theists struggle the most to defend against: the problem of animal suffering. This argues that, sure, humans have this free will that explains so many evils we see in the world, but what about animals? They don't have human free will, yet still they've had to endure hundreds of millions of years of suffering, and they still do today. Think about how many animals die as a result of predation or forest fires. Now, the primary defense I would use against this is the same natural law defense that I used earlier in the video. For God to keep an epistemic distance from us and create a system that naturally brings about human consciousness, it seems that animal suffering would likely be a necessary byproduct. That is, for us to exist in a life-sustaining ecosystem and be brought about through evolution, animal suffering is a necessity. After all, as long as animals exist, there will be suffering. Suffering is a biological imperative, such as hunger or pain. These things keep animals alive. In other words, biological systems that produce consciousness seem to unavoidably produce pain also. Some may then go on to say, why couldn't there just be less suffering? And I don't exactly know what this means. Let's say you wanted to reduce animal suffering by 90%. How would you do this? You could eliminate 90% of animals, but this seems worse to me, and I'm sure it seems worse to you as well. What about reducing their capacity for pain by 90%? See, I don't think this could work. It doesn't seem like this could come about in a biological system, as there's no biological utility to having a lower capacity for pain. In fact, it would probably be detrimental, as it would reduce their ability to avoid danger and stay alive. But still, even if we accept this necessity of animal suffering in a natural system, someone could still go on to say, sure, but animals don't get an afterlife. Humans do. So this is still not fair. They don't get compensated for their suffering. This would make animal suffering uniquely and wholly unjustifiable. And to this, there are two primary responses I would give. Firstly, while we know animals have some form of conscious experience, it is likely much diminished compared to a human's conscious experience. I would say this makes it possible that animal suffering is completely different in kind to human suffering. In which case, if a human's capacity for suffering is so far greater, can we even really compare them? And secondly, don't laugh when I say this, but many theologians actually consider an animal afterlife to be a plausible possibility. For some, this might sound silly, but it's really not too far-fetched. In fact, an afterlife for animals doesn't contradict the Bible. So there you have it, all the best defenses against the problem of evil I could give you in this short amount of time. And while, of course, the problem of evil can still be used by an atheist as part of their collection of arguments against God, anyone who tries to tell you that the problem of evil disproves God is being disingenuous, or they just don't know what they're talking about. So, did I convince you? Was there anything I said you disagree with? Let me know. And if you did enjoy, please like and subscribe. And until the next one, bye-bye.